Right, so let's take a look at some answers. So obviously I'm using the same kind of posture, the same kind of articulated movement with the lead hand, but I've changed contexts. Now you can see the rear hip is moving in, and that means that I'm using close. And you can also see that my posture is going down, not up, so I'm using close and sink. And I started with a posture which was closer to a kind of Yiquan posture, and then I bring in the rear arm, so I'm changing it into a more Yiquan style posture. And with that I'm shifting to a pivot root, only you can see that the pivot root is on the rear foot, whereas for a lead hand posture normally it would be on the front foot. That would be the orthodox set, because that would allow you to push back your weight down the bone alignment of the rear leg and into the heel and into the ground. That would set and solidify the posture. But here we've got an unorthodox set. It's lifting up the rear foot because we're using close, and that would push the weight down along the front leg. The question then, of course, is why would we do this? Why would we reverse the context? And the answer is, as we've talked about before, that there's an A setting and a B setting. What, for the sake of plain English, we call the A setting and the B setting for every posture. In fact, there's usually more than one possible variation, but there's two main settings. And you can see the word setting there either way, as like a setting as a setting on your computer, or a setting as in the way that you set the posture. There's two main ways of setting every posture. And what determines which setting we use is the purpose that we want to use it for. So just like we can emphasize one particular context over another, or emphasize one particular quintessence principle of wushu over another, so we can emphasize either force or strength. And the first thing to think about is, as we said before, if you emphasize or go with oppositional force, which open really allows you to do this because you're opening your whole body, you go with oppositional force to the maximum, open your chest as much as you can. Well, with the way that we're doing the posture with the lead pivot roots, that really leans you back away from the target. And remember, that was one of the reasons why we curtailed the movement. We made it smaller so that we can get in faster with the follow-up strike. But of course, that makes a negative compromise with range because we're moving away from the opponent. And that's a big issue. It's a technical issue and it's an ideological issue. So you hear a lot of people say, well, each one's a short range art. And well, the only way you can really get away with that is if you take the position that Wang Xiangjai takes, at least in theory, which is that each one's defensive. So usually when people say each one's a short range art, they say, well, you used footwork to close the distance. And that's not what Wang Xiangjai says. He says you wait for the opponent to attack you. Therefore, in that sense, you could think of it as a short range art. But I've said before, that's more a case of Wang Xiangjai making his life a lot easier for himself, because all of these breaking guard techniques that he talks about are much easier if you wait for the opponent to advance upon you. Much easier. In fact, it's a critical element of them in many cases. But if you want to actually attack, if you want to be in a fight that goes on longer and survive it, then all of a sudden these ideas like, well, I'll just use footwork to close the distance. Well, out of the many Yiquan instructors who say that, when have you ever seen any who could actually demonstrate that in real life? Because it's just not that simple. So yeah, we want to use footwork, but it's not even basic level to say that each one is short range and you use footwork. It's beginner level, it's dilettante level. At intermediate level, we need to let go of these fantasies of thinking, well, if I ever dared to put the gloves on and do a bit, I would just do this. Well, it's just not like that, and the opponent moves, the target moves. You throw the punch, and by the time the punch gets to the hit point, the opponent has already moved. But more importantly, in terms of what we're discussing here, we need to think about how range and range control is highly dependent on the context, or it's modified and it's in the context of the context that we're using. And in many cases, the Yiquan practitioners aren't even doing serious bag work, so they never get to understand this. So let's take a look at this example. It's sweeping of the bell and then followed straight in with a jab with the same hand. So it's open and then open again. But the target is moving, so it moves just out of range. So I use open there, but it's just as far as I can possibly go before I would have to just abort the posture and just accept that I'd missed. And that's the payoff that we make. We are reducing our range by using this technique. But we decide that that's okay because pushing back, bracing off the front foot in this way helps us create more explosive power. And this is what Wang Shangjai means by rotation around the spine axis. So from the foot, this helps brace the leg and the hip, and that in turn pushes back the rear shoulder. And from here, just like a series of mechanical levers, which is exactly how Wang Shangjai describes it. Don't listen to anyone who tells you otherwise. He describes it explicitly like this. It pushes round and then pushes the front shoulder forwards and then out into the lead hand and the strike. And this is the real genius of the idea of curtailed movement and the lock points, because we're going to brace against ourselves essentially. So we're going to form the lock point, and that's going to stop us dead in space. We don't need to hit a solid object to form the lock point. And that will, all being well, be absolutely enough to stabilise the posture if we're only just hitting for a split second. But remember this idea that each one contains all these principles which reappear again and again in different ways on different levels. It's like the same concepts emerging again and again, but in different contexts. The same principle that underpins setting postures, i.e. what Wang Shangjai calls rebound energy, also applies to hitting. And again, it's this massive problem of what we call solipsistic training in Yiquan, people just thinking you can train on your own. And Wang Shangjai himself emphasizes that one of the key concepts for power transmission in Yiquan is the mass of the other person, the mass and the momentum of the other person. They're an essential element of how we're thinking about using our techniques and force transmission. What we call in Yiquan a dual structure. So what we think of as structure has to expand into being at least two people. And most people never get that because you absolutely cannot get it just from doing Jianwu on your own. So when you hit with gap Fa Li, i.e. there's a gap and you hit and you strike, then there's going to be force that comes back into your body, and you have to be able to manage that force. So you stay in contact just long enough to transmit the force for the hit, and then you disengage, and then that makes it a lot easier for you to manage the rebound force in your own body. But if you stay in contact with a solid object like a bag or another person, then you become very vulnerable in this position because you're braced to push yourself back. And that could be the energy from your own strike if it's powerful enough, or if the opponent is skilled enough and they feel that moment, which people can definitely be this skilled, see it all the time in push hands. They can take advantage of that moment where you're vulnerable and they can just add extra force and they can ping you back easily. So to make the analysis simpler at this stage, let's decide that right from the outset, as we initiate the movement, we decide that we don't want to emphasise explosive force. Rather, we want to push against the opponent, and for that we're going to need strength. But there's no point using our strength against ourselves, so there's no point using strength if it's just going to push us away from the opponent. So we have to change the way we stack the posture to the B setting. And to do that, very simply, we just reverse the contexts from open and rise to close and sink. So the rear hip comes towards the lead hip, and we bend the front leg, lift the pivot root up on the rear leg, and that creates the extra weight pushing down on the lead set. And all of that together helps us brace against the push point. And this is the same principle that we've looked at before when we looked at context reversal. So we've just switched everything round from rise and open to close and sink. And you know, when we say there are no secrets in each one, it doesn't just mean don't keep secrets, which is something Wang Shangjai says explicitly, don't keep secrets. But it also means that there's just no secrets. Everything's in your own body. Or if you do the practice, then you'll feel these things intuitively. But that depends a lot on the kind of training you're doing. So if you're never thinking about, well, what would happen if I have to push against a weight, or you're not thinking about, well, what would happen if I have to do Fa Li when I'm in contact with someone, so you never understand about articulated Fa Li, what we call brace Fa Li, so you would never work this out, and if your teacher didn't tell you, you would never get it. And this is why, for example, you see people who start doing push hands and then get completely dominated because they've been practicing the gap Fa Li and they don't understand that when you're doing push hands, very often you have to reverse the contexts, but it's not enough just to know that. You've got to practice it. Practice, practice, practice. And it's also not enough to think that you can just do standing and you'll just know how to do this. It doesn't work like that. And remember that Wang Xiangjia himself tells us you've got to take these techniques and you've got to practice them over and over and over again until they are second nature. So if you take a look at this training footage, it's not exactly the same posture because I'm using my rear hand, but and also I'm doing it lower, but you can see that the hips are opening, the quad is opening, and this is how I would do a jab, for example, but it's a rear hand posture, so the orthodox A setting would be to use close, but I'm using open, and this feels quite odd. If you always practice across, for example, a rear hand posture using close, it will feel odd to do it using open. You have to train for this, and also it affects balance and rooting, and if you don't train for that, you just won't get it. You won't be able to do it. In fact, you'll make yourself more vulnerable when you're doing push hands, and this is what you see happen when people get completely dominated in push hands. They just haven't worked this out and they haven't trained for it. Remember that range is contextualized by the context, so it's not just a matter of knowing which context to use, it's a matter of knowing what the compromise is, and the compromise with this is that close makes you more unbalanced, at least in this posture anyway. And so to be able to use these B settings, you've got to put the time in to cultivate your level. So the other part of the test, as it were, was this posture, and we had to think about what was going on here. And this begins with the sweeping of the bell posture, and it's done in a completely orthodox way. It's a lead hand posture. We're lifting up on the lead pivot root, and that sets it back down on the rear foot, so that's completely orthodox. And then that flows straight into a cross using what we call complementary rooting, i.e. the way that the posture is lifted up on the lead pivot root is highly sympathetic to just dropping and then, like a bell swinging, just swinging straight into the cross. So our understanding of that should be very straightforward now. We've got some concepts that should be second nature to us. We've got the complementary rooting, the structural sympathy that makes the complementary rooting work, because not every posture would flow naturally from that initial use of open. And we've got the use of open and rise into close and sink. But the next thing we demonstrate is a change of posture. So we shift from the front foot into the rear foot, and you can see that that can be very confusing. I tried to think about it as I did it, so I couldn't do it. But what we're doing here is changing, we're reversing the contexts. So we're doing the lead hand posture, and we've changed the context from open to close. So we've also reversed the set. And you can also see here pretty clearly why, when you use a lead hand posture with close, it makes the posture more imbalanced. And that's why, for example, in Xing Yiquan, the posture is shortened, like the stance is shortened and dropped. So it's one of the key reasons why they do that, just to try and balance that odd use of the set. Remember that in Xing Yiquan, very often you reverse the setting to use the unorthodox B setting, and that makes the posture more unbalanced in most cases, so you have to narrow it, you have to use much more sink to drop. And remember this idea of like a chain of beautiful sins in Xing Yiquan, and Wang Xiangjia talks about this and mentions that in Xing Yiquan there's a taboo against hitting the face, which I think would come as a surprise to lots of people, and he talks about it specifically when he's talking about the sweeping the bell and saying it's a strike into the face, which is taboo in Xing Yiquan. Well, the reason it's taboo isn't for any kind of practical or strategic reason, it's because it's part of a chain of mistakes, a chain of beautiful sins, a chain of problems that all could have been solved better. So once you've got the unorthodox set and it's unbalanced and you've got to drop the posture and use sink to try and balance it more, then it becomes much more awkward to punch higher. So you create this ideology of it's taboo to hit the face, and then you start hearing the people talk about, you know, the heart-stopping punch, from a punch in the chest and make you cough up blood. And actually Wang Xiangjia talks about that as well, punching people in the chest and making them cough up blood. But he also mentions this idea of it being taboo in Xing Yiquan to punch the face, and that all comes from this problem of just trying to cope with using the unorthodox set, which makes the posture imbalanced, and that makes you sink and that makes you punch lower. to punch the face from a low shing Yiquan stance, you'd have to lift your arm right up in the air. And we're going to solve the problem differently, and here you can start seeing how the infinite curriculum works. So the way we're going to solve the problem is we're going to have that posture occurring only for a split second. So that unorthodox set of the lead hand with a rear pivot foot, that's just going to be a transition posture into a cross. So it's going to smash down a guard and then go straight into a cross. But we still need to have a lock point for the sweeping the bell posture and then a lock point for the cross. So how are we going to do that? Did you work it out? It's quarter rooting. So remember that quarter rooting is where we lift the foot up, but it doesn't go back down again for the second posture. It does two postures, 1, 2. But this is so fast as a posture, it's just one sweeping movement, so it doesn't even have, it's not quite a 1-2, it's like a 1.5, if that. So we can't have the clear articulation of 1-2 in the complementary rooting. We can break it down like that, but when we do it faster and faster and faster, we start to compound the movement so that to the naked eye at least it looks like one movement, but in reality you can feel it in your own body that it's two movements. It's two sets of the foot. Just like when you throw the ball for the dog using one of those ball throwers, you can't see the set mid-air where you just have a lock point for a split second and the ball flies out. You can't see that to the naked eye, but you can feel it in your body. And if you don't do that, the ball will just keep going forwards until it hits you right in front of your own feet. It won't fly out. So we make this quarter rooting faster and faster until it becomes almost like it's just a single movement. And if you got all that, then well done. That's a real step forwards in your conceptual understanding. And there's a few other things you could have got as well, but hopefully everyone got all of that.